All right, one of the topics that sometimes comes up on the AP test in regards to civil rights issues, especially in modern times, is the concept of affirmative action. So it's a fairly controversial program in the minds of many. There's kind of two schools of thought of it on it. Affirmative action, if you're not familiar with it, is it's an effort to sort of provide um, equitable employment and educational opportunities to groups that have historically been discriminated against, whether it be like racial minorities or discrimination because of gender. It's an acknowledgement that historically groups have been discriminated against, and affirmative action is an attempt to provide like an extra little boost in employment and educational considerations to members of those groups that have historically been discriminated against. It's important to note that we're going to focus on affirmative action's role in the college admissions process, but that affirmative action can be used in the areas like general employment as well. So we're going to focus again on the Supreme Court's sort of like long and sort of a bit confusing history with the concept of affirmative action. So the first affirmative action case to reach the Supreme Court involved the University of California's admissions policies back in the early 1970s. The case was called California versus Bach. And basically, the court was considering California's admissions policies, the University of California's admissions policies. And in dispute was that the university was using racial quotas as part of their admissions process. So, like, for example, that you're going to let 10% of the incoming students coming in, they would have to be African American, right? Like X% would have to be Hispanic, X% would have to be Caucasian. Like you're actually establishing rigid racial quotas. The Supreme Court decided that quotas were essentially unconstitutional, they were discriminatory, and that they left the door open that race could be a consideration in the college admissions process, but something as strict and rigid as a quota, like having to let a certain number of each group in, they deemed not to be permissible. So that's sort of like the Supreme Court's stance. The bottom line being, really since 1972, the Supreme Court will allow race to be part of the admission process if it isn't too much of a consideration. Well, that's a difficult verdict or decision because you've sort of left the door open for a steady stream of future cases. They're challenging that, like, all right, well, this university's race consideration of race is too much, or like this university's consideration of race is too much, right? Like you've left the door open for future challenges because you're saying that race can be a factor, just can't be too much of a factor. So two examples of like future cases, they look similar. Grutter and Gratz versus Bollinger. Bollinger being the president of the University of Michigan, and both of these cases involve the University of Michigan. So the first case in the green box, Grutter versus Bollinger, involves a student, Grutter, challenging the University of Michigan's law school admissions policies. And in this particular case, the Supreme Court sort of looked at all the factors involved and said that because race was only a small consideration of the overall picture of who got into the University of Michigan Law School, that they were going to basically uphold Michigan's like policies. But in the Gratz case, right, they looked at the undergrad admissions policies and they actually struck down the policies, right, that Michigan was using in that case because they thought the undergrad policies were too reliant on race. So, for example, the University of Michigan set up for undergrads, every piece of your academic, like, sort of like portfolio was worth a certain amount of points. Like your GPA was worth a certain number of points, your class rank, your number of activities you participated in, whether you like participated in activities but held leadership positions, your like everything, right? Grades, everything. It's worth a certain point total. If you achieved 100 points on University of Michigan scale, you were offered like to be part of the class. So like the parts that were sort of deemed to be too reliant on race, for example, like if you received a perfect SAT score, that earned you 12 towards the 100 points. If you were part of a historically discriminated racial minority group, it earned you 20. So the Supreme Court argued that that was like out of whack, and that was like too greatly reliant on race. So again, that's what affirmative action is. There, two schools of thought, like it's controversial sort of action. Some look at it as a necessary remedy for historical discrimination, and others look at it as we should always just be making decisions based on merit. Again, it's a complicated argument, but the part that you would see on the AP test is sort of like what role has the Supreme Court played in this, and that's essentially saying that race can be a small component of the college admissions picture. It just can't be too much.